Well done, Mum. Me again. Yep. Chapter 7, Going to America. So, here we go. Again, actually, this is one of my favourites because we can relate a lot to this. Not that we were there, of course, but because Dad told us quite a lot of this or confirmed it for us. So, now that Trevor is twice a grandfather, this was in 1987, some time ago, it is time to tell, I think he's 14 grandchildren now. It is time to tell what Grandma remembers of his trip to America at the age of 8 with his brothers and mother. This was during the first year of World War II. Britain's entry into the war in September of 1939 was followed by the so-called phony war, when hardly any activity was obvious on land, although at sea war was raging. During this time, children and old people were evacuated from the big cities, while many families moved out into the country to rented accommodation or to relatives. Daddy and Mummy looked at possible houses to rent in places like Cumber and Newcastle. Already in April of 1940, since the three boys were now quite big, it had been agreed that Nurse Carol would go home to Carlow. In mid-June, the family went for a holiday to the Slieve Donard Hotel in Newcastle. It was while they were there that they heard France had capitulated and signed an armistice with Hitler's Germany. And it was while they were sitting one afternoon in the hotel lounge that they heard Churchill make his famous and inspiring speech about the fighting on the beaches. As the Germans advanced through France, Belgium and Holland to the Channel, Daddy thought of sending the boys to America with Mummy, perhaps to stay for a time with Croak, if she was now well enough after her grave illness and operation a year before. He and Mummy debated this possibility by the hour. It was a most difficult decision to make, which was finally done for them by an announcement on the radio that a ship of the United States Line, the Washington, would be taking US citizens from Britain to New York, calling on the way at Galway on the 5th of July. That was it. Mummy was a US citizen with a US passport, to which Rodder's and Kenneth's names could be added, and Trevor held a British passport but would be allowed to travel on the ship. It took Daddy 2 days to make up his mind. Such a process had to be quick in those days, so full of threats and rumours and disasters and fears. The radio had been heard by Daddy and Mummy probably on the 26th of June. On the 27th, they decided that she and the boys should go. Only a week now in which to pack up and return to Skibbereen to make the travel arrangements and to pack again, this time for America. The boys would need as many of their clothes as would fit into 2 big trunks. Mummy, who expected to come home before the winter, leaving the children with relatives like the Coles or the Greys, would not need to take much. Trevor and Rodder, who was 5, got excited. Therefore Kenneth did too. None of them could realise the dire implication of all these preparations, while Daddy and Mummy had no time to dwell on them. On the 22nd of July, 2 days before departure, Mama, Auntie Olive and Auntie Hazel came to say goodbye. Mama went upstairs and tiptoed first to Rodder's room, then into Kenneth's. Trevor was a weekly boarder at Garth House. There were tears in her eyes as she looked at her sleeping grandsons. On the last day, Mummy went to Marshal Swan, the dentist, and revered yachtsman, and had her hair done at Rotker's. Trevor came home from school, and in the evening Uncle Wilson and Auntie Jessie came to say goodbye. On Thursday, the 4th of July, a scorching hot day, Daddy got his 3 children and their mother and himself into the Dublin train. Trevor was carrying his little red case, filled with items he thought would be interesting on the journey. Rodder had his little brown one, packed by himself. Mummy can't remember anything about Kenneth's case, except that he did have one. On arrival into Dublin, the party went in a taxi to the Gresham Hotel for lunch. Oh, the Gresham, good. Where am I? And afterwards in another taxi to the Kingsbridge Station. Mummy can't remember how the mass of luggage got from Amiens Street Station to Kingsbridge and eventually to Galway and the docks there. What she does remember is the extreme heat. When Daddy got his family settled into their compartment on the train, he kissed each one goodbye and walked away. When one of the American ladies in the compartment exclaimed in a loud voice, "Oh my, aren't you going to see him again?" Mummy wanted to hit her hard. Daddy later wrote to Mummy that he had gone on foot from one station to the other, and when he got to Belfast at 6 o'clock, he had driven to the yacht club for something to eat, and then to the Royal Belfast for a golf lesson. Oh, he was okay then. Obviously, he had not been as exhausted at the end of that day as his sons and his wife. It was a long, slow, hot journey to Galway, in the course of which Mummy served the boys their supper from her little case. There were sandwiches and fruit and some kind of beverage. At long last, very tired and sweaty, they arrived in Galway and took a taxi to the Eglinton Hotel in Salt Hill. Mummy believes that Daddy had arranged for the luggage to be conveyed in some way direct from Amiens Street Station to the train and to the docks in Galway. The only thing the boys wanted and needed was to get cool and go to bed. So Mummy filled the large bath along the passage from their bedroom with cold water. There was no hot, and in they got, all three together. After that, to bed, and almost instantly to sleep. The manager of the hotel strongly advised Mummy to get down to the dock as soon as possible to have the luggage cleared through the customs, since in the morning there would be bigger crowds of people and greater hustle and bustle. So after the chambermaid had promised to keep an eye on the boys, Mummy set off at once for the docks. The manager's advice had been good. It was slow work finding all the pieces of luggage, getting them all assembled, and finding inspectors to deal with them. Many other prospective passengers were busy at the same thing. In the morning, with the boys running around, it would have been a nightmare. It was midnight before Mummy, exhausted, got to bed. What a day. I'll pause there for a bit. 1 second. The next morning, the boys were called at 5:30. They dressed, packed their cases, and got into a taxi. Even before they reached the docks, they saw the Washington at anchor in the still and glassy waters of the bay. It was already another hot day. The boys were swamped in a great crowd of people on the tender which took them to the ship, which they boarded through a large opening on the side. The Washington seemed to be already bursting with passengers, among whom were dozens of children, and a further contingent from Ireland had yet to board her later. New arrivals were quickly distributed to their cabins. Mummy was dismayed to find that, in addition to the 3 berths and a cot for Kenneth, in what was a very good cabin, 2 emergency army-type cots had been set up. Trevor and Rhoda claimed the 2 bunks, one over the other, while Mummy took the berth opposite, under the porthole. There was a nice little shower room off the cabin, with wash basin and loo. It would be splendid accommodation for the 4 boys, as long as the other 2 people stayed away. Later in the day, she discovered that the swimming pool was filled with army cots. She was feeling that they were not used. She had a feeling that they were not used. Yes, good. Since none of the family had eaten since they left the train, they were overjoyed when the breakfast gong sounded, and lost no time in making their way to the dining saloon. There they were greeted by lively music of the ship's orchestra. Wow. At breakfast, the family had a round table to itself near the middle of the room. What Mummy remembers about the breakfast is that it was very good and was ravenously downed. After breakfast, it was learned that the Washington would remain all day off Galway so as to pick up any further arrivals for the passage. Mummy thought, no chance now of keeping the cabin to ourselves. She was wrong. There were few arrivals, and none came to occupy those 2 camp beds, which were removed next morning, giving the boys and their suitcases much more room. The first day was full of the excitement of exploring the ship, at which Rhoda proved adept. Mummy had booked first sitting for all meals, so when the gong sounded for the first sitting at lunch, Mummy said, "Come on," took Kenneth by the hand and started off for the dining saloon, a few decks down from the lounge. Rhoda said, "I'm going this way," and dashed off in another direction. When Trevor and Kenneth and Mummy got down, there was Rhoda waiting at the entrance. After that first lunch on board, Kenneth's little silver pusher was missing and was never seen again. Mummy had neglected to bring it away to the cabin, and although she asked the steward about it afterwards, it was never found. This was a pity, because it proved to be irreplaceable in the USA, and Kenneth had to learn to eat without it. Breakfast and lunch had now been enjoyed on the Washington, but dinner that first evening, and on every subsequent evening, was an occasion never to be forgotten. The orchestra played away, not as background music, but in competition with the deafening hubbub of crying and screaming children, many clad in pyjamas and dressing gowns, and of scolding, distraught parents. All this in total contrast to the elegant and luxurious setting, while stewards took orders for cornflakes and milk, while proffering menus suggesting caviar and champagne. After the boys were in bed, Mummy embarked on her bit of exploration, which was miraculously rewarded by finding two of her Bryn Mawr college friends. Margaret Cuss, now Mrs. Desmond Flower, living in London, who had her little boy with her and Anne Anderson, a special friend in the same year, who, as Anne Tierney, had lived in the same floor in the same hall as Mummy. Although born and brought up in England, she had cousins in the States, to whom she was going with her two little girls, Sarah and Margaret. After this meeting, the Andersons and the Boyds saw each other daily. Although the former, travelling in cabin class, were not allowed to visit the latter in the first class, there seemed to be nothing to prevent the Boyds slumming, as Anne said, on the cabin class deck. The decks in daytime presented just as astonishing a sight as the dining saloon, and at night, children swarmed over them, several dozen being pushed around in folding prams. In those days they were not called pushchairs, and buggies had not been heard of. At night these were stacked and lashed by the sailors. Mummy was surprised to find a number of mothers who had almost no experience of looking after their own children. There was one woman who didn't brush her little daughter's tight curly hair for 3 days, because she didn't think she'd be able to manage the curls. These mothers had always employed nurses or nannies, and as a result were quite helpless. On deck there was a lot of fun for the children, as well as falls, fights, tears, collision of prams, and deck games. Trevor enjoyed shuffleboard, which he tried to teach Roger. Trevor was interested in everything that went on board. Kenneth was most interested in how long it was until the next meal, and in sticking close to Mummy, especially when the ship's foghorn emitted its shattering noontide blast. Once, when Trevor and Rodder had been in charge of him at that moment, he had cried so inconsolably that they refused stoutly ever again to look after him near noon. On the Sunday afternoon, the Washington at last set sail for New York. The entries in Mummy's diary are as follows. Monday, cold and rainy and faintly rough. Kenneth not very well. Tuesday, cold and rainy. Kenneth miserable. Wednesday, hot. Kenneth still miserable. Thursday, hot. Kenneth still miserable. Friday, Kenneth in bed all day. Packed. Hot. On Saturday, Kenneth was better and the ship docked in New York. The Boyds had arrived at the place that they had been travelling a week and a day over land and sea to reach. Standing on deck, looking down over or through the ship's rail, they could see Croak and Auntie Keith looking up, trying to spot them on the crowded deck. Before being allowed ashore, all passengers had to be inspected by health and immigration officers, an endless procedure in the ship's lounges. Trevor, with his British passport, having to go to a separate lounge. He was proving good at fending for himself in such circumstances. At long last the family came ashore to be hugged and kissed by Croak and Auntie Keith, and what a blessing it was to have them there, leaving Mummy free to deal with all the turmoil attendant on having the luggage inspected by customs officers, especially since Trevor and Rodder remembered Croak so well. When this was finally got through, it was lunchtime. Croak had booked rooms for all the family at the Pennsylvania Hotel, so that was where they went for lunch, in the coffee shop. What impressed the boys most there was the bowl of sugar lumps on every table, each lump wrapped in paper. Kenneth had recovered sufficiently to enjoy his meal. After that, Auntie Keith went to her house, while Croak and all the boys went to their rooms for naps. Trevor and Rodder had a twin-bedded room with its own bathroom. Mummy and Kenneth had the same, while Croak had a room with a bathroom to herself. Again, I'm just going to pause and have a drink of water. That's better. Good. The following morning, Sunday, Croak took Trevor and Rodder in a bus to Central Park, while Kenneth stayed with Mummy. In the afternoon, Trevor stayed with Croak, while Mummy took Rodder and Kenneth to the zoo in Central Park. Later, Croak explained her plan for the family's first stay in America. After 2 more days in New York, she would take them all by train to Maine, where they would spend the rest of the summer in a house which was rented near Uncle Rensselaer and Aunt Marion, with Emily and Bill Muir. So next morning the boys went shopping with Mummy. They got attractive summer dressing gowns of white flannel with fine checks of navy and dark red. Then Auntie Keith took all the boys to her flat for lunch and the whole afternoon. Sometime during this day, Mummy can't remember when, Mummy took Kenneth to see Dr. or Uncle Phil Van Ingen, a paediatrician and great friend of the Shaw and Wiles families. Auntie Keith was born at Shaw. Mummy can't remember either why she took Kenneth to see him or what Uncle Phil said about him. On the last day in New York, Auntie Keith gave Trevor a very special treat, taking him to lunch and to the Natural History Museum, where he was particularly interested in the dinosaurs, some of which he was able to identify. That sounds like Dad. That afternoon, her sister-in-law, Lillian Bossy, came to visit Croak and the boys. With night came the excitement of boarding the night train called the Bar Harbor Express. This was the boys' first experience of an American sleeping car. It was a carriage without compartments, with pairs of seats on either side of a central aisle. At night, the porter made up each bed into 2 berths, one above the other. Croak and Mummy slept in one pair, Mummy being above. The boys occupied another pair, Trevor and Rhoda sleeping head to tail in the upper berth, while Kenneth slept below. The boys found it more fun than did Croak and Mummy. In the morning, they all went to the dining car for an excellent breakfast. Bowls of wrapped sugar on the tables were there too, while the porter unmade the beds, which again became seats. Porters on American sleeping cars and Pullman cars are always black, so the boys made their first acquaintance with a black person. Thus, after breakfast, they could all sit looking out of the windows at the sea, as the train ran along the rocky New England coast. At a little station called Ellsworth, they piled out of the train, where they found Uncle Rensler waiting for them in a big car. In this he drove them across a long bridge to Deer Isle, and this was exciting for Mummy, because when she had last been on Deer Isle as a child with Croak, the only way to cross had been by ferry, and a very small ferry at that, barely big enough for one car. And funny enough, Emily Muir writes in her book of that experience too. Once on the island, they drove to a little village called Sunset, and a little way beyond to a small, rough wooden hotel in the fir woods called The Firs, where Mummy and Croak had spent a summer during World War I. Now it was still run by the same kindly Quaker family called Knowlton. While the party was spending 2 very pleasant days at the Firs, some of the Knowltons sailed Trevor and Rhoda and Mummy across to Barrel Island one day, while Mrs. Knowlton looked after Kenneth and Croak, nursed a horrid cold. And I think Barrel Island was one of the islands that Bill and Emily owned, I think. Croak's chauffeur, Caleb, was driving her car north from Washington, where he and Croak had loaded it before she went to meet the family in New York, with all the linen, silver, and other things that would be needed in the rented house. Without Caleb, Croak and the boys would never have managed moving in. He was black too, and the boys became very fond of him and he of them. One day, when Kenneth was sitting on Caleb's knee, he put up his hand to touch the brown face and asked, "Does it come off, Caleb?" In the village, the house was known as the Nye House, after the owner. Ah, the Nyes. Yeah, Emily writes of them too. It was very near the Firs. Downstairs there was a bedroom for Croak. The bathroom were also downstairs, as were the sitting room, dining room, and kitchen. Up a very steep flight of stairs were 2 other bedrooms, one for Trevor and Rhoda, one for Kenneth and Mummy. The wonderful thing about this place was the huge barn, which a previous owner had converted into a studio for painting, and which the present owner had transformed into an enormous playroom with the loft still at one end. There was no room in the house for Caleb, so he had to sleep in the village. He did all the heavy work about the place, including carrying wood for the big stone fireplace in the playroom. Mrs. Eaton arrived every morning in her car to cook and clean the house. It was Aunt Marion who had discovered and rented this lovely house for Croak. Every day Caleb would drive the boys and Croak to her and Uncle Rensler's house, where there was a wonderful natural seawater swimming pool which could be filled at high tide. Emily and Bill used to come over from their studio every day, and almost every day the family from the Nye house stayed for lunch. Bill one day painted a charming picture of Rhoda and Kenneth playing naked on the rocks at the shallow end of the pool. Because Bill wasn't pleased with it, he threw it out, but Mummy was delighted to retrieve it. It still hangs over her bed in 1987, and we know it is now in Glade. One of Mum's favourites, funny enough. And in the Lochview Fold in 1996, Emily and Bill were the greatest fun of all and loved playing with the boys as much as the boys loved playing with them. There were sailing trips to smaller islands, fishing trips, picnics. Caleb was very fond of fishing and often took Trevor and Rhoda with him. Flounder were what they caught, and the family would have them for supper. Emily and Bill had a great friend called Manuel, who was in the US Navy. Again, Emily writes a lot of him. When on leave, he came to stay with them and was as much fun as Bill and Emily. In this way, thanks to Croak, life was very happily arranged for the Boyd family, now at the beginning of their wartime sojourn in North America, which was to end 2.5 years later when they started their Cook's Tour home, which I think is a later chapter. There we go. 21 minutes. There we go. That's brilliant. Well done, Mum. See you soon. See you very soon. Lots of love.